Morning, everybody, and you're welcome to the Teagasc Signpost webinar. My name is Noel Meehan, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 218th edition of the Signpost webinar. This morning, we are joined by Professor Richard McDowell, who is the Chief Scientist for Land and Water New Zealand, and Richard is going to give us a chat this morning on his reflections on water quality and land use in New Zealand. So you're very welcome this morning, Richard.
Nice to be here.
We're also joined by Cathal Somers. Cathal is a water quality specialist with Teagasc.
Morning, Noel. How's things?
You're very welcome, folks. So Richard is not joining us from New Zealand, despite being from New Zealand. You're down in Johnstone Castle, Richard, at the moment.
I am indeed, yes, and enjoying the sunny southeast.
Yes. There's I take that tongue in cheek. It's the weather has not been great anywhere, even in the sunny southeast. I'm afraid this autumn.
It was a bit breezy last night, yes.
Yes, that's for sure. So Richard, you're going to talk to us this morning about the goings on in New Zealand around water quality and land use.
I am indeed, yes.
Okay.
We're just, I guess, finishing up a tranche of work that's been going on for about 8 or 10 years. And I thought while I was over here, I'd offer some reflections about that.
And we're delighted to hear your reflections. I suppose we often compare ourselves with yourselves in New Zealand around obviously dairy production and agriculture production, but also I think more recently we're beginning to compare ourselves on water quality and greenhouse gases. So I think it's good to get some insight into how water quality measures and legislation and policy all tie in New Zealand and how they maybe compare with ourselves. So I think without further ado, if you're ready to share your screen there, Richard, we'll let you get going.
Right. I guess I just thought I'd start by offering folk some insights about the policy scene in New Zealand. It's different to here. Of course, water quality has been an issue for us for many decades. Not to say it's bad, but when you start from a good base, you want to try and maintain that. And to do that, we have, I guess, a different setup. We have some national direction, and that is set by the Ministry for the Environment, but it's implemented by a range of regional authorities, 16 of those, regional councils they are called, and they will implement plans based on a catchment, and down through those plans, they will affect what farmers do. So there may be allowed or prohibited practices, or indeed prohibited or allowed land uses. So with that in mind, I guess the national direction has really only just come into force, although it has had a long gestation beginning in 2011. It's now in effect, as I said, in 2024. And it came about, I guess, a little bit after another issue, I guess, that we were tackling, and that was associated with greenhouse gas emissions. And those emissions, much like yourselves here in Ireland, are largely driven from an agricultural base, but they've been highlighted, I guess, overseas as being a potential problem. And that international pressure has come through in the form of multinationals who purchase the products that we produce. And I've given the example here of Nestle, which influenced, I guess, how Fonterra were thinking about what they are producing and where they're getting it from. And hence they've set targets for greenhouse gases, which are now not necessarily impacting, but they're being considered by the farming populace, and they're also considered by Fonterra, by them putting in a payment schedule that rewards people for having lower greenhouse gas emissions. Now, a similar agency to the Science Based Targets Initiative is the Science Based Target Network, which are looking at fresh water. So they have an array of companies accounting for $4.3 trillion US dollars, some of which you can see there. And they are piloting a system where they're looking at where they can get the best efficiency, i.e. lowest losses of nitrogen and phosphorus from their product lines, from their value chains. And that's where, I guess if you look into the future, that's another factor in addition to GHGs or greenhouse gases that we're probably going to have to be considering. But, science has to keep up with that. And at the moment, it isn't. And I'll give you an example here. So this is a comparison between the European Union and New Zealand. And it's just focusing on E. coli, fecal indicator bacteria. Probably heard about it, as triathletes and others were swimming in the Seine and getting sick from the bacteria associated with that. On the left-hand side, you can see that, it's a nice, lovely picture for the EU in terms of compliance. In fact, here you've got nearly 80% compliance. Now, if we look in the New Zealand situation, you could say that we've only got 27% compliance. The similar threshold here, but the difference is where we apply them. In the EU, it's largely associated with beaches and some inland waters, but very few. In New Zealand, it's every river and stream, every major river and stream. As a consequence of that, you can get an awful lot that are non-compliant, but it's not necessarily where people swim. So, a little bit of apples and oranges there. If you're also to look at nitrate nitrogen, the picture is different there as well. But it's probably favoured more towards the New Zealand end. In fact, if you were to look at the mean concentrations of nitrate in and the classes by which you could compare them, the situation in New Zealand probably looks a lot better. But again, I caution, it's where you measure and if those sites are in an agricultural catchment. Give you an example. In the EU, the ones that are I guess the best tend to be in Norway, and that's because they're in a lot of forested catchments, not necessarily agriculturally driven. So you've always got to look at the cause of the issue. And I'll give you two examples here. New Zealand's a long, skinny country. You can have 7 meters of rainfall on the western side of the South Island and 600 millimeters on the eastern side. That rainfall pattern and the distribution of rainfall, as it's influenced by what's called the Southern Oscillation Index, which is just a difference between 2 points in the Pacific and Tasman Sea, means that you can have quite different rainfall patterns year on year. And that can drive what water quality is. It can enrich or dilute. Here's two examples, and you can see in the bottom one, it's highly synced with the Southern Oscillation Index, but those trends are way out of sync on another water quality site. That means if you don't understand what climate is having on water quality, you could be calling for action where you don't need it or missing the need for action. Now, however, you don't tend to farm in extreme areas with extreme variation in climate, although that is changing. And on the right-hand side, we've got a comparison there of different livestock classes and forestry for all catchment studies since the 1970s. And you can see there that you can be losing lower amounts of nitrogen in, for example, dairy, than some other livestock classes like mixed sheep and beef, or indeed red deer. Yes, New Zealand does account for around 90% of the world's venison trade, so that's a big industry for us. It's a small one internationally. But the important point here is that management and management actions do have an effect in agricultural areas. So how have we been traditionally accounting for that? Well, over the last 15 years, and indeed now as well, We've had this model where you've got both leaders and laggards and a big chunk of people in the middle. Be similar here. It's all around the world. Same sort of model applies, where you've got the leaders who are encouraging people along by adopting new practices, and they tend to suit a nice voluntary approach. Where you've got some laggards who don't necessarily pay attention or just accidentally miss things sometimes, but also repeatedly. And they require some regulation. But it's a combination of these two approaches which tends to work the best, allowing for flexibility. Just to give you an example here, in the early 2000s, the dairy industry implemented something called the Dairy Clean Streams Accord, which advocated for a few simple practices like fencing off livestock exclusion of streams and rivers and lakes. Also, having better dairy shed effluent practice. So that's the equivalent of applying dirty water only when the soil could absorb it, not during wet periods. And bridging streams and rivers so they weren't going directly through. Now, some of these are not only common sense, but they have been shown to last for a long period of time. I've just given you an example there. Although this is from the dry stock sector, in fact, this is a red deer stag, and he's decided to dig up this area, which is right next to a nearby stream. But when it was fenced off, you saw immediately that positive effect on water quality. And that effect has been sustained for about 20 years now. So I guess in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, that small investment in terms of livestock exclusion has proven to be successful. Now, as I mentioned, over those 15 years, we've developed that policy, but you've got to test your policy as well. And initially, we didn't have data on who was doing what where. So we had to come up with what we called farm types that were representative of different areas and the farm actions that were happening in those areas. So we had about 137 of those, but 40 or 50 of those would probably cover the most of agricultural catchments in New Zealand. And when you're developing policy, you want to ask some simple questions such as, where are the problems? What can be done to fix that within my current enterprise, for example? And the most extreme question to consider is, well, if I can't do anything that's going to meet what people expect in terms of water quality, either two things have to happen. One, those expectations have to change, or two, you have to change land use. And being a young country, we're not actually that adverse to changing land use where it makes sense, but it's normally being driven by economic drivers and not necessarily environmental ones. So we examined what those farm types were at the present day, at least when it was in 2015, and I'm also going to show you where it could be in 2035. So we've looked at the practices of 1995, 2015 and 2035 in both the dairy and the dry stock sheep and beef sector. We've looked at nitrogen and phosphorus. There's also some work that's done on sediment as well. And what these plots are showing here are two things. One, there's been a substantial reduction, and you can see that because the checkered line or extension of the bar graph is what nitrogen and phosphorus losses would look like if you were using the practices of 1995 in 2015. So they would have been roughly around a third worse for nitrogen, and for phosphorus, they probably would have been about double. So you can say that people's actions over those 20 years have had quite a significant impact in terms of reducing those losses. But you can also say for nitrogen losses, well, they probably have it in taken pace with the level of intensification, considering that the dairy industry probably went from just under 2 million to just under 6 million cows in that 20-year period. So that was, okay, the easy stuff, okay, 2015, that was all the simple stuff like livestock exclusion, better dairy shed effluent practice, bridging, not applying only as much fertilizer as is required. With any sort of, I guess, science team, there's always a case of developing new mitigation actions, okay? And, but they're not established. And so we call these developing. And they could be anything from having collars on cattle to direct them away from streams and critical source areas. Also, variable rate irrigation. That's an interesting one where you would apply your nutrients through the irrigator. The irrigator would only apply as much water as was being forecasted, but also being responded to by maps showing how much water the soil could take up and how much nutrient was being applied, relative to sensors which would say, here's a urine patch, here's not a urine patch, switching it on and off, and thereby reducing nitrogen and phosphorus losses by about 70 or 80% compared to uniform rate. So we applied all of these strategies to each of these farm types on the basis of least cost, most effective, and so stacked them up and said, okay, what was the reduction that was possible with that? So, compared to that, 1995 version, we've got that implementation of established mitigations, assuming that everyone does it, that has done it. There would be between a 20 and roughly 25% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus. But then, we layer on all those developing mitigations as well. And that reduction would probably be at around a third, 34 to 36% to be precise, in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus losses. Now, you subtract that away from the baseline load, either what was current load at that stage. There are still areas, though, where the concentrations would be likely to induce algal growth, okay? And those are the areas in red on the right-hand side. They represented around 13% of agricultural land, so quite a lot. But you could also argue that mitigation was an effective tool in that remaining 87%. So we fortunately, there'd been some work initiated in the early 2000s that looked at farmer uptake and the effect of mitigations over time. What happened in the early 2000s was that there was a science team came out. It's much like your agricultural catchments programs. This started in 2001, by the way. The science team would interact with the farmers in the catchments. These were dairy catchments and had a strong signal of dairy in those catchments, okay? Through that interaction, they would identify catchment-specific mitigations that were tailored to the biophysical processes and management actions in those catchments. There would be field days as well, but there would also be one-on-one modelling of their properties in terms of their nutrient losses. There would be concurrent water quality sampling, and there would also be regular surveys of what people were doing in terms of mitigation actions. After 10 years, that extension phase ended, i.e. the science teams no longer went out, there were no long field days, etc. But what was happening were their surveys were continued, as were the water quality measurements. So you could see, I guess, the lag or layover effect from that extension phase. And what happened was, I'll give you, this is just from one of those catchments. And admittedly, this is on a log scale, so the slopes on these are much, much higher, but just wanted to fit a few in here. And so there, you had problems associated with poor effluent practice. And indeed, some didn't even have land application. They were just pumping it into a soak hole and away it would go. In this situation, they had implemented infrastructure. So they put in both standoff pads, and they're also improving their effluent practices. And over time, each one of those infrastructure implementations resulted in a step change. And so that slope, in terms of water quality concentrations, improved. It decreased to a point where there was no more to do in terms of infrastructure. And that's where it kind of plateaued, it evened out. So it wasn't just better effluent practice, we also had wintering. So in the southern parts of the country, which are cooler, insufficient pasture growth meant to get maintenance feed. They would normally have a brassica crop grown over the autumn to sustain them over the June, July period in winter. And you can imagine probably 350 kilos of N per hectare being ingested, and about 85% of that would have been lost, deposited onto wet ground, cold, probably leached. The other factor was that sometimes they were located next to streams, and wet, cold, bare ground, that's a recipe for runoff. So moving them away from those areas, which you could call critical source areas in that case, also led to significant improvements. Now, take-home messages was when we looked at those data, you could see when people stopped doing those actions, and that correlated to when the water quality improvement stopped. Okay, so this is the first, I guess, definitive piece of evidence that we've got at a catchment scale that farm scale actions led to material change, i.e. improvement in water quality over time. Now, the kicker with this is that that extension costs. We don't do anything for nothing in New Zealand. There's no subsidy for that. So we costed it out. Admittedly, it's 9,400 New Zealand dollars, so that's about 6,000 euros per farm, or about 1,000 euros per year. Now that model, though, has actually been adopted nationally. So there is a requirement for every farm that is greater than 20 hectares to have what is called now a freshwater farm plan, where they will have to assess the risk of contaminant losses to water from their property and then put in actions. Over time, those actions will be audited so that you can see a decrease in the risk. It's hoped, I guess, that through implementing this nationwide, you'll see a similar sort of relationship to this, similar sort of effect that we saw in terms of the catchments. It's also, I guess, hoped that the cost is going to come down demonstrably, simply because there's a huge number or a huge increase in providers associated with that, and that's estimated to be probably in the region of around 3,000, so maybe 1,800 euros for a farm plan, which might be assessed every 3 years. We've also, I guess, with that farm planning exercise in mind, thought about, okay, you must have biophysical consistency across that. You can't be saying that, okay, in some sections of the country, we've got a low management risk, and hence, well, that means that our overall risk is of, for example, nitrogen loss is low. It's only when management is combined with biophysical risk that you get an overall risk that's representative of that area. Otherwise, you could be having two people doing exactly the same management, one on a tight soil and one on a leaky soil, and be ranked the same. You've got to have that biophysical consistency. So we've developed tools that enable that to happen. Here's one example. I've just shown you the nitrogen transport risk associated with this. And that's developed out of learnings from similar sorts of exercises in the US that looked at biophysical, biomanagement risk, but there they took a state-by-state approach, and that led to 48 different versions, many of which weren't comparable because they didn't have that same biophysical underpinning risk being consistently considered. Now, that's all bright and sparky for 87% of land use that could possibly reach water quality targets through mitigation actions. There's that 13% roughly that can't. So we did an exercise, a thought exercise admittedly, where we said, what's the suitability of different enterprises? That could be blueberries, apples, almonds, dairy, sheep and beef, forestry. Each had a water quality loss and a greenhouse gas footprint. We considered them both together and we said, okay, well, let's swap out leaky land uses with less leaky land uses, but try to maintain the profitability as best we could, considering other factors such as infrastructure, proximity to pack houses, etc. We've done that taking into consideration, well, in some areas you just can't have some land uses, and so you might have to swap out, for example, sheep and beef for pine trees more than you would in other situations. And that is where we've, I guess, differentiated between a climate-focused and a freshwater-focused strategy in that instance. But they both have, I guess, synergies associated with them. So when we looked at these nationally and said, in that 13% of area where you'd have to do a land use change, what would it have? What effect would it have on the different sectors? So for the livestock sector, it probably decreased by about 10 or 13% in terms of stock numbers. That's in line with our climate commission. Commensurate with that would be a third increase in horticulture and cropping. That should say hort and crop, not just crops. Then also a doubling of forestry, of most of which would be exotic forestry. Now, when you add all that up, depending on which focus you have, it can be between a $66 million gain and a $421 million loss. But when you look at it in terms of our export values, which measured in the tens of billions, 50 billions, it's much less than 1% of exports, and those exports would still be maintained. But another fact that we found useful to communicate was that because the cuts, I guess, in terms of water quality were deeper and harder to meet, you could meet those greenhouse gas ones by doing that, but you couldn't meet water quality targets by just focusing on greenhouse gases alone. So that's actions and stuff that we could potentially do. But it's important to consider that there's a lag time between what you do and when you will see those effects in the stream and river. So we've had to look at lag times, and I've given you an example here where we've got data at a 30-kilometre square grid across the country from 1990 to 2017 for stock numbers get translated through into nitrate being leached. So we can trace at a catchment scale the increase in those losses. Here's one example in central Canterbury, in the Waimakariri. You can see there that the losses from dairy, which is the only stocking class that increased in that catchment, substantially increased around 1999. Loads in the river, though, increased around 5.5 years later. That's what we call a lag time, okay? So in that river, the accumulated lag time for everyone doing land use change in that effect, in that catchment, and then seeing it in the river was around 4.5 to 5.5 years. Nationally, it happens to be about 4.5 years where we've been able to do this work. And that gives you some indication that it's not all lost, okay? You don't have to focus on the 80 or 100-year lag time associated with many deep aquifers and groundwater. Especially for surface waters, that lag time can be quite short. There is another factor, though, one that you will be just as, I guess, concerned with as we are, and that is detecting any improvement. Our regulatory authorities, I mentioned 16 of those, they will go out and measure around 1,000 sites, probably once a month. Now, you can appreciate that it doesn't rain on those days every time. So you often miss storms when storms carry the majority of contaminant loads. And so you might be misrepresenting the overall annual picture. So we had to come up with a way and a tool by which we could estimate how many samples it would need and what would the cost be of detecting the change that you desired in your water body. We've done that for every site across the country. If you want to do it in 5 years, you've got to take an awful lot more samples because your chance of hitting those storms is less than if you were to do it over a 20-year period with that same frequency. The kicker here, though, is that, okay, well, if you take 12 samples monthly, okay, that's fine. But depending on how variable that contaminant is, something like E. coli or indeed phosphorus, which is driven by storm spikes, can be very hit and miss. So you'd have to take far more samples than you would have to take for nitrate, which just tends to carry on there relatively smoothly. So in order to detect the policy changes, we would have to increase our number of samples by around 5 times. So that's quite a lot of samples, and it's a lot of cost. Same situation occurs in groundwater, where, for example, only 40% of our sites would be able to detect reductions necessary within a 30-year period, but that would increase if you doubled it to 60%. Now, the consequences are, right, one, you take more samples, or you change the water quality limits, or you take more samples at sites that are sensitive to land management. And this is what we've done. So we've developed a tool that's there, monitoringfreshwater.co.nz, where you can focus in on any catchment, any river, lake, or groundwater site, and you can say, what's the likelihood of detecting a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% change? And then, or how much have I got to spend on sampling? And what would be my likelihood of detecting that change? This is important information because when you're wanting to develop plans, for example, a catchment level, you might say to everyone, well, you've got to reduce by 30%. And then someone's going to say, well, can you tell me when it's going to improve? And unless you've thought about one, the lag time, and then secondly, how many samples you need to take, you won't be able to say. So that's where we're at the moment. It's my, I guess my final and parting comments. At the moment, we're in the process of implementing those freshwater farm plans, and then regional authorities thinking about how and where they are going to detect those improvements. That's set against the knowledge that we now have, which is that most catchments will be able to meet those water quality thresholds in their current land use. But we also have to consider there's variation around that, and that some folk might find it harder to absorb those costs than others. Where we can't, i.e. in those 13% of areas, changing land use, or indeed some new mitigations that we haven't thought about, might be useful. And then we have to think about what's the transition and also opportunity cost associated with that, and how long would you need to do it? Thinking that, most change happens over around a 20-year period. Now, 20 years is also fortunate if you happen to be wanting to detect changes over time. And that's got to set the expectations about what people are doing and where and when they are doing it. Because you need to give that positive reinforcement back to folk in order for them to buy in, and for that middle that I was talking about to shift more towards the leaders and away from the laggards. those parting comments, I'll say ka kite, that's me, I'm done.
Perfect, Richard. Guramahagat for that. That's very interesting. Thanks very much. Very enlightening. Can I just say to the listeners, and I forgot to say at the start, we have a Q&A there for questions that you can submit into us, right? And we haven't had too many in yet, and that's probably my fault because I didn't mention it. So let's get a few questions in there from the audience for Richard. But I suppose I'm fascinated by the whole land use change area and how that would work. And I'm just trying to think ourselves here in this country. We have a very strong attachment to the land, and asking farmers. We're trying to drive forestry and things like that, and farmers are very reluctant to go there because it's I don't know, it's historical. I suppose we have a very strong attachment to the land, and we generally don't want to see it going back into forestry or taken away from agriculture. But I suppose I was just looking at your maps there. You had a map for the 2035, and you had there's a couple of red areas on the periphery that I think the point was that they weren't going to meet what was needed. And I suppose maybe is that where land use change is going to come in? And then I suppose the knock-on question for that, and something I think in Ireland we need to consider, is what is the implications for the areas that this happens to, if you have to take it out of intensive dairy production. What's the implications from an economic, social, and so on point of view? Have you any thoughts on that in your line of work?
Yeah, so it's a big question, Noel. I'll try and break it up into first of all, what are mechanisms that you could use to encourage land use change? And so in that, I'd be thinking around incentives. We don't have subsidies. Just put that out there. In the mid-1980s, we went from the most subsidized to the least subsidized agricultural country in the world, and we've maintained that ever since. The only real incentives we have actually come from the processors. And you are starting to see that, although it is only the green shoots, pun intended, in companies like Fonterra, Synlay's another dairy company, there are others as well, which are having differential pricing associated with compliance and or leadership in environmental performance. So overall, everyone could be receiving for example, well, we deal in kilograms of milk solids per hectare, so you might say $8, okay? But there might be a premium where some folk are getting 10% extra and other folk are getting 10% less associated with that. That can shift the dial. So that's one element of it. Another one is the advice element of it. And you guys have got a great network here in terms of getting that advice out. We showed with that catchment study that advice works. Okay, but it's got to be targeted to the catchment. And indeed, the current government has put a lot of investment in catchment groups. My only concern with those catchment groups is that they get the right advice, so that they are giving, in turn, it's a little like training the trainer. Okay, so you've got to have the good, consistent information going out to everyone, not just select parcels. Then the final one is around the regulatory aspect of it. And that's where, one, we've got to see practical and consistent implementation of those water quality limits and not just cherry-picked. Okay, so for example, I only presented greenhouse gas, nitrogen and phosphorus. I didn't present E. coli, and you saw that was a big problem. But if you didn't implement E. coli everywhere, then it might default back to nitrogen and phosphorus, okay? So that's another example of where you've got to have consistency and think about the practicalities of that regulation as well.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned there about obviously the lack of subsidies and the incentivization of that. And it was interesting to hear you say that the big business is beginning to see this now, that they need to get in there. I suppose, the the drivers for that, obviously they see this as maybe, I presume, their markets are going to reject their product that they're not green, or produced to the highest standards from an environmental footprint point of view, but also in order to protect from the whims of policy change that maybe a government could do. So I think, in Ireland, we're seeing that from the industry point of view. Definitely, the dairy industry are putting a lot of effort into trying to do that extension piece that you mentioned, to improve water quality in Ireland. I suppose I know we're talking about maybe the payments on your milk solids per hectare and so on. Have they gone to a point where they're putting boots on the ground to try and do that extension piece that you mentioned is so effective? And if they are, at what scale? And I think you slipped in a comment there that's very important: the consistency of messaging around what they're saying.
Yes.
Is that being addressed by the industry, be it beef or dairy or whatever out there?
Yeah. So you're right. New Zealand is probably one of the most exposed countries to international trends and whims. So there's a strong push for processors to take into account their market needs, obviously, and hence you've seen that with greenhouse gases. You're starting to see it now with water quality, albeit just at a pilot basis. It'll come, and that'll add increased pressure. Now, in terms of getting the boots on the ground, the driver for that has actually been regulatory, in addition to some folk being market leaders and wanting to be seen as market leaders as well. I mentioned freshwater farm plans and the fact that they are now mandatory for every farmer over 20 hectares, which is the vast majority. So you would have to produce that farm plan, and it would have to quantify the risk of contaminant losses and what you were doing year on year to address those risks. Now, that's where the consistency of message has to come across. It's in its initial stages, so there is a wide variety. And I mentioned if you didn't have biophysical risk accounted for consistently, you'd get completely different answers in terms of absolute risk, and that we've seen examples of that. But we've also seen the processors, but also other industries, supporting industries like the fertilizer industry, having extension people, what you'd call extension people, out there dealing with their clients one-on-one and helping them through that farm planning process. And through that, you're seeing an increase in the level of uptake. We did a piece of work, we just finished a piece of work actually, which looked at the likelihood of implementation and the rate of implementation. And developing the new science is one critical aspect of that. And the way you did that was also important, so that if you did it with stakeholders, you got increased uptake and rate of uptake. In fact, the rate of impact, the rate of uptake increased by about 35% on average, and the maximum level of impact implementation also increased by around 40%. So getting people in line, getting a consistent message is a major factor to getting successful outcomes in terms of water quality.
Yeah, and like you mentioned that the rainwater farm plan, I think is what you called it. Yeah. So if the project I'm involved with at the minute, we have very similar rainwater management. I'd imagine it's very similar. I'd be interested to see what is contained in your rainwater farm plans. But I think I'm sure it's the same kind of a theory where you're identifying where the risks are on the farm and how water moves. But I suppose the question I'm going to come to is how you give farmers these plans, and I know there's a level of inspection going behind, and you kind of alluded to it there in your answer to the previous question. But what role has the kind of the community or groups of farmers or that kind of the early adapter guys that move out, and that if there's 15 farmers in an area and 5, 10, 12 and there's 3 guys left over, do they feel the pressure, or how important is that kind of peer pressure, or do you see any evidence of that working in New Zealand in various catchments around?
Yeah. So from memory, I think there are around 300 catchment groups spread across the country. Different sectors support those. With staff, for example. And there is an element of one showcasing the good things, and then also scoring, giving people scores. So when you're down in the pub, people can have a conversation. I'm a 7.8, whereas versus I'm a 6.2, whatever metric that is. Anyway,
Yeah.
So there is an element of peer pressure, driven by competition. We're quite a competitive bunch.
Yeah.
But there will also be folk who don't associate with that, and indeed are completely disinterested. And that's where the mandatory farm plan has to help those people. So it has to be meaningful to them. So it's not seen as just a level of compliance. The thought is that these will be the basis of farm plans. Indeed, many authorities already have them for not just freshwater, but for other things such as biosecurity, animal movements. And so you're able to roll a whole level of compliance into one, as opposed to having it piecemeal.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, while folk might get support from their industry sectors around developing those freshwater farm plans, it's the regional authorities that come in and do the auditing. And there's a level of consistency amongst those, which is different, hopefully better, but different to those around the providers of those farm plans. And so that's a check and balance on their performance over time.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. You've answered that question. Listen, I'll put you over to Cathal there, and there's questions that have started to fly in there on the Q&A. So thanks to everybody for that and keep them coming in. Okay.
Yeah. Rich, start off. There's several people after saying excellent presentation and well done, really, really interesting. But I'm going to start with a bit of a comment for you. And maybe you'll just comment and explain for some of the viewers that mightn't be that familiar with this. But a comment is, it's probably worth noticing that your graph showing the improvement over time in New Zealand since 2005 have y-axes of orders of magnitude, so a lot more impressive than a linear scale.
But I'm a pointy head, so I wanted to get as much in as possible. It's my fault. So your viewer is absolutely right. I probably should just have concentrated on a couple of exemplars, but there's the full picture for you.
Perfect. And why is there a 20-hectare threshold for requiring nutrient management plans? What about the intensive horticulture and the other land uses less than 20 hectares, I suppose?
Yeah, they're not excluded. I was just mentioning those for pastoral enterprises. And so you wanted to exclude what we'll call lifestyle blocks, which tend to be in the 4 to 8 hectare range. And they'll just have a few animals on. You don't want to... in fact, there's just as much land under lifestyle blocks as there is under arable cropping. So, that would be an awful lot of processing that was unnecessary just for a few animals out in the back paddock.
Yeah. We, I suppose, have a lot of discussions around here at the moment as regards stocking rates in Ireland with the derogation. I'm sure you're quite familiar. I've spent a bit of time here recently. What is the stocking rate in New Zealand?
It's a bit higher in terms of dairy, and it's around 3.2 cows per hectare. It varies. It's higher in the South Island, which is more recently developed than it is in the North Island, which has had a longer history. But yeah, you've seen that increase through a combination of one, good payout, and then amalgamation of farms as well as demographics have changed.
Well, what would be the kind of normal sized dairy herd out in New Zealand at the moment?
On the South Island, you're probably talking over 500.
Do you see that rising, or has it
No, I
changed
don't.
drastically in the last
No, I
5, 10
don't
years?
actually.
Yeah.
I think we were, probably haven't got this right, but I think we had peak cow, as some folk call it, around 2017, 2018. So it's slightly decreased now. You might see an increase in some herd sizes for efficiency reasons.
Yeah. A lot of interest in the lag time. We talk about it a bit here. I suppose the bit of mitigation, like that you mentioned, when you put an action in place, people want the answer now, not in 5 years' time. But how did you calculate the national average lag time for nitrate loss?
Yeah, so that gridded nitrogen losses across the country was approximately 30 years long. And you also had loading rates that you would calculate from in-river detection of both discharge and of concentration. So you get a load by the mass of, in this example, nitrate going down the river. So you could see the increase in loading rates onto the soil from increase in stocking numbers, and that would increase suddenly. In that particular instance, 1999, you saw that increase, but the loading rate came through around 4.5 years later. That was just one catchment, but the data were available nationally. So where you're able to see that change, you could calculate the difference in that uptick. And on average, it was about 4.5 years, but there are a lot that were less than a year and a few that were around 14 or 15 years.
And politically, and the non-farming community, non-landowner community, how did it feel about lag times, or how did that go down?
Well, actually, they're quite familiar with lag times, but only through groundwater. And they're used to I guess the journalists saying, oh, the lag time is 80, 120 years. And that's exactly right. In a deep aquifer, that's what you'll see. But in a shallow aquifer, you're going to see responses quite quickly, potentially within a few months, and definitely within a river, which receives a lot of water, not only through base flow fed by groundwater, but also through surface runoff. So you'll see that very, very quickly. So they're familiar with lag times. Now it's about setting the expectations for when you're going to see those improvements come through. And I'm actually encouraged by having those lag times out there, because they're a lot less than 80 or 120 years. So they're in people's mindsets now, okay? I'm still going to live to see this.
And there's $6,000 per farmer for mitigations, what was kind of mentioned in water quality measures. Was that, I know you touched on it already, but was that regulation alone for implementation? Was there knowledge transfer, advisory tools? How did that happen?
Yeah, so that was the cost associated with, it was 6,000 euros. I probably did a wrong conversion there, but that was the cost associated with us as scientists going out, doing some investigations, offering advice, following it up with measurements, etc. And then also the regional authority coming in with doing water quality measurements as well. So when we left, that would reduce to almost zero. Quite expensive. But the evidence was also gained by farmer surveys, periodic farmer surveys. They wouldn't be expected to pay for any of that. That's more of a research tool that was used to prove that the water quality actions were leading to improvements.
And that probably leads on to the next question about the water quality plan that you mentioned that you have for farmers. How quickly do you think farmers will adopt that? I suppose Noel touched on that we have something similar here, and you drop a plan with a farmer, but it's no good unless you follow up and you see if there's progress made. So how is that going to happen, or what's the plan?
Yeah, I can give you an example in the province where I live in Canterbury. There's an awful lot of irrigation that happens there. Every one of those irrigators, though, via that regional authority, has been required to have a equivalent of freshwater farm plan. So what they've done is they've said, okay, this was your baseline at the start of the operation. Over this period of time, you need to reduce by, for example, 30%. They've gone through an exercise where they not only audited records, fertilizers included in that, but there are actions more appropriately around effluent practice, for example, and then modeled the outputs associated with that. In one scheme, for example, which is probably the largest one, they have around 95% compliance now with just a few folk that will be visited more frequently than others to encourage them along. There are repercussions associated with not meeting those A grades, fully compliant, and they tend to vary from regional authority to regional authority, but some of them can be litigation.
When you say visited, do you mean inspected?
Inspected, yeah, although we don't say inspected.
Yeah, that's a nice psychology term anyway. But so who do the farmers value information from the most in New Zealand? Is it extension advisors, farmers policy, and you talked about already the likes of the processors, Fonterra, are putting big strides into, like, who's the biggest impact, who has the influence, and maybe where's the gaps?
Well, I imagine, much like us, there's a degree of skepticism associated with any advice that you receive. So number one would be your neighbour, probably. Number two is going to be the person who's paying you. That might be your bank, or it could be your processor. There would also be support from the sector. So there are levy body. Most industries have a levy, which is then paid to an organisation, which is used to promulgate the success of that sector, like dairy or dry stock. Then you will have the regional authorities come in. They are a trusted source as well. Science will be in the mix there as well. Then you'll have the urban-rural divide. So there would be no advice taken from someone who doesn't visit a farm ever, for example. So there's a continuum there in terms of trust, but it's not as divisive as you might expect in some jurisdictions.
Yeah, so quite driven by inspection and possibly penalties. But did you go down the route similar to here, where we have water quality advisors on the ground?
No, they have. The regional authorities will have land management advisors, which will link through to the science team to provide advice around actions and what to do in that particular catchment. The sectors will have water quality specialists, but there are relatively few. The fertilizer industry plus the processors will have teams that have an environmental bent to them, and so they have some training associated with that, but it won't be their number one job. So there's a mix there. We haven't got the system like you guys have, where you have dedicated extension specialists.
Yeah.
Although that has changed recently, with a few being employed by the Ministry for Primary Industries.
We probably won't get time to get to all the questions, but one final one, Noel, is, Rich, you've spent a bit of time here and you have a lot of interest in New Zealand. Any advice to us? You're a little bit ahead of us, let's say. Any advice to us in mistakes we should avoid, maybe?
Well, yeah. One mistake that I would see is, and it's associated with politics, really, and that's flip-flopping, going from one extreme to the other. And the advice that you get associated with that. Science should always be independent. There should be a sustained avenue, but avenue of investment, but accountable for that investment, that provides consistency of advice that is consistently checked as well. If you don't have that, and if you just have spurts of it, you'll end up with situations where you don't have the scientific backing, nor the people around, because they haven't got a job any longer, to support the decisions that are being considered. And that you keep on top of that so that you don't have flip-flopping. You guys have got that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the role of the Common Agricultural Policy, to keep it, and the Water Framework Directive, that it's a consistent. But I suppose farmers would feel there's been a lot of change in the last 5 years, in particular with the various nitrate action plans that have happened, and they feel like they keep getting asked to do more and do more.
Yeah.
And I suppose, unfortunately, water quality in Ireland hasn't improved in the last while. So I suppose that's why they're being asked to do more and more. But totally agree. You need to have farmers need to know where they're going, so they can plan going forward. And we have a little bit of uncertainty going forward with the derogation. The threat of that being taken away. So it's a chicken and the egg situation, whether farmers will invest and do things, or will the derogation go, and it's not helping the situation out there. So I think
Yeah.
that comment is a very real comment, and a very
I mean, I have one parting comment about that. It's get the evidence for change and the sampling to provide that evidence in train now, because you need to have that bank of evidence to be able to say, well, yes, we can advocate for that policy because we can detect it, or we haven't got a show of doing it. So let's think about it in terms of practicalities.
Yeah, no, look, that's excellent, Rich. Really appreciate you taking your time from your study trip over to Ireland to talk to the Signpost webinar and give us your thoughts. There's an awful lot of similarities between what you guys are doing and what we're doing, and it's always good to hear the nuggets of information that you get from external speakers, or speakers from other countries, and what we might be able to apply in Ireland. So really appreciate you taking the time, Richard, to talk to us today. So look, I just want to thank our listeners for tuning in this morning. We had a very good listenership as always. And I want to thank Cathal Somers and Yvonne Maher in the background for joining us today. Next week, we have our own Catherine Keena, Countryside Management Specialist. She's going to present to us talking about better hedges for all, and also she'll be launching the National Hedgerow Week for 2024 next week as well. So without further ado, thanks to everybody, and safe home, or have a good day, and safe home to New Zealand, Richard, when you leave. Okay, bye. Thanks, guys.